Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 48. Before we get into today's questions, as usual, big thanks to our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration, and I want to bring your attention to a fun fact from a recent blog post, and that is that as you get fitter, you will start to sweat more, which can sound a bit counterintuitive, but Precision Hydration published a blog post called Do You Sweat More As You Get Fitter? And it gives you the explanations for why that is. And the main takeaway there is that you do that to regulate core temperature. So the more you sweat, the more you can regulate core temperature, keep it down. And that's why as you get fitter, you get better at regulating that temperature, but that happens through sweating. However, the more that you sweat, then that also means that you need to pay more attention to your fluid and electrolyte needs. And that's what Precision Hydration can help you with their free online sweat test to give you recommendations for how much fluid and electrolytes to consume during extended exercise or races. And you can find them and the test on precisionhydration.com, answer the 10 questions or so that's in that quiz and get the recommendation. And then just give Precision Hydration a try and see if it works for you. You can get 20% off your entire order with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW20, and that's only valid through the end of August, so a few days left, a week or so by the time that this episode goes out, to take advantage of that. You can also get your first box or two for free with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Today, as part of Roka's Details Matter campaign, I want to talk about the Gen 2 Elite Tri-Suit. And this detail is sent in from Sean at Events. And he writes, I can't get over the silicone print on the inside of the legs on the Gen 2 Elite race apparel. I raced Ironman Arizona in this suit, and the legs never rode up and never chafed. Plus, the no-sew finish looks sleek, but still offers compression. Roka put a great amount of time, money, and effort into many tiny details like this, which adds up to really, really great products for endurance athletes, whether it's wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, high-performance eyewear, you name it. It goes across the board, and you can find their products on roka.com, as mentioned, and you can get 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS, all caps. The first question for today is from Mikko in Finland, who writes, how should one train to lower VLaMax on the run? First, just a quick repetition about VLaMax for those that don't know or don't remember. If you want the longer explanation, definitely go and listen to episode 169 with Sebastian Weber. I'll link to it in the episode description. That's where you get all the information about that. But to give you the short explanation, it's the rate at which you can produce lactate. So your maximum rate at which you can produce lactate. So it's not your maximum lactate concentration, it's the rate at which you can produce lactate. And why would you want to lower that rate? Well, because having a lower VLaMax makes you sort of more of like a diesel engine. And as triathletes, that's really what we in general want to become. There are exceptions. You can go too low. There is too much of a good thing. There is such a thing. But in general, if you lower it and you're not at that level yet, that will increase your fractional utilization of your maximum aerobic capacity. That is your VO2 max. So in other words, you will increase your anaerobic threshold and you will move it closer to your aerobic capacity. And it will also decrease your carbohydrate utilization at submaximal intensities and instead increase your fat oxidation at those submaximal intensities. So that's the short explanation for what it is and why you would want to lower it. And that is why Mikko is asking about it, because he knows that, lowering it might be beneficial. So how do we go about it? Well, it really is with workouts that are very much corresponding to the ones that we talked about in episode 169 for cycling. So strength endurance type workouts. It means doing tempo runs, for example. So accumulating extended durations at moderate intensities. So tempo runs, and we're not necessarily talking just 20 minutes, but actually this is quite timely because we just had Matt from Sweat Elite on talking about how the elite runners do really, really long tempo runs. So I think that's something that we can take away from that episode for sure, that you can build your diesel engine to be even better by doing those tempo runs to be longer. And that means don't try to overshoot the intensity on the tempo runs. Try to go for duration rather than intensity on those tempo runs. So tempo runs is one key thing, or moderate intensity training in general. In cycling, we have things like low cadence work is a very familiar way to decrease VLaMax. You could do that on hills or on the indoor trainer or into headwinds. But we don't quite have that in running, but we do have hills. And that works to our advantage as runners when we try to lower VLaMax. So that is a great way to go about lowering VLaMax by just running a lot of hills, because that will, well, first of all, I should say that you can do this as part of your normal endurance runs or long runs. It doesn't always have to be specific hill workouts. It can just be choosing a hilly route for your run. And I do know that most people, including myself, don't live where we can do 15-minute repeats uphill easily and repeat that sort of workout. So just choosing a hilly course, running up and down hills, that will cause you that when you're going uphill, you will work at higher force outputs, and that will then activate those fast twitch fibers. And eventually the stimulus may be big enough to make those fast twitch fibers more endurance-like, which is what happens on a cellular level when we are talking about lowering VLaMax. Of course, you can also combine the two, which is actually one of my favorite workouts. So doing hilly tempo runs. So you could do something like a continuous tempo run on hilly terrain, like a 1 hour tempo, or do something like 4 times 15 minutes or hilly terrain, and do them at a tempo effort. So you don't need to be concerned about perfect pacing. You don't need to worry if your heart rate is higher going uphill and lower going downhill. You don't need to worry if your power, if you're using running power, is higher going uphill than it is when you're going downhill. Just run at a solid zone-free moderate intensity effort and try to accumulate duration there. And actually, the uphills can and maybe should feel harder than the downhills. But remember to still keep the foot on the gas in downhill so that you're not just jogging or cruising, but keep your effort and heart rate at a decent level. If you don't have any hills at all around you to work on hill running, whether it's as part of normal easier endurance runs, long runs, or tempo runs as just discussed, then a good idea might actually be to do this sort of hilly tempo run just described indoors on the treadmill. I remember personally doing a lot of indoor hill running in the final months before my personal best half marathon race. And well, that's some time ago now. That was 2015, but I haven't run a half marathon since 2015. So I'm actually quite keen on trying that, giving that a go in the winter, perhaps. We will see. Either way, that using a treadmill to get your hilly tempo runs in, that can be a good way to work on VLaMax if you don't really have a good hilly courses to run on. And I think personally, I felt those runs made me really, really strong and well prepared for running a good half marathon. So that's it. Hope that answers your question, Mikko. Thank you for that. And the next one is from Roger in Minnesota. Roger writes, "You did a great job in episode 193 of summarizing the performance benefits of caffeine and guidelines and amounts before and during a race from studies. I had a quick follow-up question that might be a useful Q&A episode item. Can you comment on whether it is important for athletes to be at a low level of daily caffeine consumption to see these effects? For example, if I have 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day normally, will that minimize the ability to see the benefits? I have heard some pros talking about cutting out caffeine in the month before Kona or a big race to maximize the impact of caffeine on race day." Thank you, Roger, for your question. That is a really interesting one. And I made sure to go through some studies that I've read in the past, but didn't quite remember exactly to make sure that I got the gist of it right. And I guess the gist of it is that the answer to this question is clear as mud. So I guess that we don't really need to see the world as it is at this point in time. We can all choose our own preferred reality, which for me would mean keeping my coffee routines. No, but in all seriousness, there really isn't super clear evidence either way, because results are quite mixed. There is, for example, one study from 2017 by a team in Sao Paulo that is called Dispelling the Myth that Habitual Caffeine Consumption Influences the Performance Response to Acute Caffeine Supplementation. So what they did was they took 40 male endurance-trained cyclists and they allocated these into 3 different levels of daily caffeine intake. So low intake, which was 58 plus minus 29 milligrams per day. That was the standard, the average or the mean plus minus standard deviation. Moderate was 143 plus minus 25 milligrams per day. And high caffeine consumption was 351 plus minus 139 milligrams per day. Then these participants, they did 3 30-minute time trials on the bike. And they did that following ingestion of either one of the following, which was caffeine in the amount of 6 milligram per kilogram body weight, or a placebo, or a no supplement at all. So a pure control group where they didn't even get the placebo effect. So when these athletes had caffeine as the thing that they ingested before the time trials, they went 2.5% faster on average as a whole group compared to the placebo condition, and 3.3% faster compared to the no supplement at all control condition. And the researchers then did a lot of statistical analysis of the various results and the different groups that they created based on daily caffeine consumption. And they found that the low, moderate, and high caffeine consumers showed similar absolute and relative improvements in cycling time trial performance following acute supplementation of 6 milligram per kilogram body mass of caffeine. Performance effects of acute caffeine were not influenced by the level of habitual caffeine consumption, suggesting that high habitual caffeine intake does not negate the benefits of acute caffeine supplementation. One thing that is quite interesting here is the role of individual variation, because overall about half of the cyclists saw a caffeine-fueled boost in performance that was greater than the natural variation in repeated time trial results, which according to this study is about 3%. So that's what you can expect if you just repeat time trials in a control condition. So that's sort of an error source that they need to take into account. The other half, they mostly saw indeterminate results, so couldn't quite tell whether they had a benefit or not. And a small number, 4 of the 40 athletes, actually saw negative results, so they decreased their performance by more than 3%, which was that error margin. And this study is good in that it had 3 different groups, including a placebo group and a pure control group, and 40 cyclists. So it's the biggest study that I know on this topic. And it is consistent with some findings that caffeine boosts performance for a lot of people, but not for everybody. And so there are groups of people that it doesn't help, and it may even slow down a few. And the variation in that other study that I remember reading had nothing to do with habitual caffeine consumption, but instead it depends on certain gene variants that influence how quickly you metabolize caffeine. So an interesting takeaway message from this study is that if you don't feel that the caffeine helps you, you may well be right. Because just because it works for quite a lot of people, it does not mean by any means that it works for everybody. So that's evidence against the fact that cutting out caffeine would be beneficial, or that not cutting out caffeine would dampen the effects of the acute caffeine supplementation. However, there is also evidence on the contrary. So this is a 2019 study called Time Course of Tolerance to the Performance Benefits of Caffeine. And this is from a team in Madrid. This study only had 11 participants, so that's not a big number, but they do have a lot of data points, because what they did was to put these participants through 2 separate 20-day periods. And for one of these 20-day periods, they took 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram body weight per day. And for the other period, they took a placebo supplement. All these participants, all 11, were habitually very light caffeine users. And between these two 20-day periods, they had 7 days of what's called a washout period. Before and after the study, and 3 times a week during the study, the participants completed a VO2 max test and a 15-second all-out sprint. And they did this indoors on an exercise bike. And the researchers then tracked how the performance benefits from caffeine would or would not change throughout that 20-day period when the participants took caffeine or did not take caffeine. So imagine this: you are very light or non-consumer of caffeine habitually, and then you start taking this caffeine supplement, 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day, which if you're a 70 kilogram person, for example, that turns out to be 210 milligrams, which is a decent amount of caffeine. So that would have been classified as a high caffeine consumption in the previous study we talked about. So does this mean that when you do the time trial before, or the first time trial, the first time you have consumed caffeine and you're habitually a no or light caffeine consumer, that you get a bigger benefit than you get when you do one of those at the end of the 20-day period, where every single day during that period you've supplemented with caffeine, with quite a lot of caffeine? That's basically the question that they wanted to answer. And when we look at the results for different things, for VO2 max, for the power at VO2 max, or peak power, which is the highest power that they reached during that VO2 max test, and the sprint power, which is the average power for the short sprint that they did, we do see a pattern. And by the way, I'll link to both of these studies, and you can look at the figures and see these. The subjects get a big boost from caffeine in the first few days, and then the effect that they get, it starts to taper off, but it never gets to zero. So they still get a performance benefit. It's just not quite as large as during the first few days of that 20-day period, where they don't have that background of having consumed caffeine habitually day after day. And looking at the charts, for example, this is not something that is statistically significant or anything, that day 20 equals day 6. But if we just look at the chart, that's the way it looks like. So at day 6, it has tapered off to a certain level, and then it stays there throughout the rest of the 20-day period. And these results seem to indicate that caffeine tolerance may decrease the effect that you get from caffeine supplementation, but not eliminate the effect completely. But what we need to keep in mind here is that this does not answer the question at all about how long you should abstain from caffeine if you need to do it. That's not a question that can be answered by the data from this study, and that might depend on your habitual level as well. And it's not a question that has been answered, to be honest, in the studies so far. So clear as mud, as I said at the beginning. My take is that I want to feel good in general leading up to a race, and if I lose 1% by not abstaining from caffeine in race week, I'll take that. The comfort of my normal routine and the feel-good factor in the week leading up to the race more than makes up for that, in my opinion. And I have done the abstaining from caffeine thing, and I do think, based on that personal experience, that I do better with keeping my normal caffeine routines, and still supplementing with caffeine. And I do feel that I still get an effect doing that. And I will definitely change my opinion when we get convincing evidence for otherwise. But as discussed here, we have mixed results, and you can choose how you want to see the world in this particular instance, I guess. That's what I jokingly said at the beginning. So thank you, Roger, for your question. I'm sorry that it might not have answered the question, but not given you a specific action guide at least, or step-by-step, this is what to do, but hopefully food for thought at least. And that's it for questions for this week. I want to thank you again, everybody who have been leaving ratings and reviews. There were quite a few coming in these last couple of weeks, and I'm really, really appreciative of that. So I'm going to read one, which says binge-worthy 5 stars. This is from Eric52 in the US, who writes, better than a binge-worthy show on Netflix. That triathlon show has so much quality content, and it is certainly helping shorten my learning curve. Thank you, TTS. Thank you, Eric, for that. Really appreciate it. And also thank you to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test to get your personalized hydration and electrolyte strategy. And use the promo code THATTriathlonshow20 to get 20% off your entire order, only valid until the end of August, so hurry up. Or to try your first box or tube for free, use the promo code THATTriathlonshow, all one word, all caps. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. If you're looking for things in the categories of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, then look no further. Go to Roka and take 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.